Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History, as we look today at the corrupt bargain following the election of 1824 that brought the era of good feelings to an end forever. Now, in the 1820s, a new wave of democracy was sweeping across America based on universal white manhood suffrage, which was becoming increasingly common in America. Some states even let all free men vote, including free black men, as Tennessee did, at least under our original Constitution, in which you did have to own property, but property was so cheap it was easy to meet the qualifications, and race did not affect your ability to vote. We changed that, I'm sorry to say, in 1835. Vermont, when it became the 14th state, was the first state to allow all white men to vote, even those who did not own property. And as more Western states were admitted to the Union, they followed suit. After all, Western land was so cheap and so easy to get that even if you had property qualifications, they were so easy to meet that it hardly seemed necessary to enshrine them in the law. And these Westerners, newly toughened up by war with Great Britain and the Indians, had new heroes: frontiersmen, military men, Indian fighters, like Davy Crockett, who would eventually be elected to Congress from Tennessee; William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, nicknamed Old Tippecanoe, for his first victory over the Indians in the War of 1812; and Andrew Jackson, long a political figure in Tennessee, now a national hero after his victories at Horseshoe Bend, at New Orleans, and Florida against the Spanish and the Seminole, and known to the world as Old Hickory. Indeed, only two men in American history, at least to this point, have managed to have entire concepts of government named after themselves. The first, of course, is Mr. Jefferson. The term Jeffersonian Democracy refers to a democratic government that does as little as possible to interfere in the lives of the people. And the people are envisioned in Jefferson's democracy as economically independent yeoman farmers, although an elite of the most talented members of society, the best educated and the most thoughtful, should perhaps have the final authority. Men like Thomas Jefferson. But as a new wave of democracy swept across America, described at the time as the New Democracy, it came to be described as Jacksonian Democracy. Less because Jackson was a great philosopher who defined this form of democracy, than because this was the democracy that he rode to power. And the New Democracy is the idea that democracy should be a true democracy, a government of the people, and that the people themselves ought to govern. Now, prior to the 1820s, presidential electors, the men who officially choose the president and vice president of the United States, were chosen by the state legislatures. Indeed, each state does get to choose how to choose its electors. But this was changing in the 1820s as more and more states allocated their electors based on a popular vote within the state. Indeed, in 1824, 18 out of 24 states chose their electors through a popular vote. By 1828, every state but Delaware and South Carolina did so. Delaware would change in 1832, although South Carolina would not allow popular voting for the presidency until after the Civil War. Now, aristocratic Easterners looked down on this Western rabble, on what they called the Coonskin Congressman, whom they elected. They described their attempts to take over the government as the tyranny of king numbers, the tyranny of the majority the founding fathers had feared. But in turn, the common people criticized King Caucus, a personification of a caucus system in which a political faction would choose one member from its own ranks, often secretly or at least without popular voting. Again, a small group of political leaders choosing one of themselves to be the candidate for their faction. The popular slogan became, "The people must be heard." And this new democracy was characterized by massive voter turnout. In 1824, about 25% of eligible voters actually bothered to take part in the election. But by 1828, at least half participated. And by 1840, perhaps the peak of this new democracy, 78% of eligible voters participated in the election. And this popular involvement was due to the many momentous issues of the time. The Panic of 1819 and the power of the Bank of the United States worried many people as their own finances seemed so precarious. The Missouri Compromise awakened people to the dangers of sectional controversy, even as it tried to keep that controversy quiet. And furthermore, the Bank of the United States and the Missouri Compromise showed people how important the federal government really was, how it could have a direct influence on their lives. Up to this point, most people had seen their state and local governments as far more influential and important in their daily lives. It was not unknown at all in our early history for men to turn down or resign from federal positions to take a job in their state or even local government. The first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, resigned from the court to become governor of New York, for example. Because to many people that seemed more significant. And while it's true that most people still felt a greater loyalty to their states than to some concept of the Union, they did begin to see the federal government as the powerful institution that it was and that it could be. Now, the first few years of this decade had been characterized by a lack of open political disagreement, although quite a bit went on under the surface. James Monroe's presidency, which seemed relatively serene, with a Republican Party unchallenged by Federalists or anyone else, was known as the era of good feelings. But behind the scenes, a younger generation of politicians was eager to take power for themselves. And with Monroe's retirement in 1824, the time for good feelings was over. As in 1824, many talented men ran for the presidency. And what they did begin to say they were running for the presidency. The old policy of standing for election was starting to fall by the wayside, although even now, too much personal involvement still seemed a little bit unseemly. One of the early candidates for the presidency was John C. Calhoun, James Monroe's Secretary of War, but seeing how many other men wanted the job, he stepped aside and ended up as the vice presidential candidate of not one, but two of the other candidates for the presidency. And why not? Everybody's a Republican after all. And of the other men who did seek the presidency, there were four major ones who got electoral votes. William Harris Crawford from Georgia had been Monroe's Secretary of the Treasury, and the Congressional Caucus, and leaders of the U.S. Congress, believed he was the man who ought to follow Monroe. But this elitist caucus system was so unpopular, and indeed, at least officially collapsed after this election, that it kind of worked against him to have that endorsement. Furthermore, there were rumors that his health was poor, and it turned out he had a stroke close to the election that left him nearly blind and paralyzed. He still got third place in the Electoral College, nonetheless. John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts had been Monroe's Secretary of State and the son of a former president. He was endorsed by the state legislature of Massachusetts, but although he was often seen as kind of being inflexible and tied down by his principles like his father, he was enough in touch with the public mood that he refused any official nomination by a caucus because he knew how unpopular those were. Henry Clay from Kentucky had been Speaker of the House of Representatives on 3 different occasions, and he was nominated by both the Kentucky and Tennessee state legislature. Harry of the West ran on a program of internal improvements and government spending that would come to be known as his American system. And there was Andrew Jackson, the great war hero, Old Hickory was despised by some, especially Henry Clay, believing he was ignorant of politics, ignorant of national affairs. But that was not entirely true. He may have had almost no formal education, but he had been involved in Tennessee politics since around 1790. He had worked as a lawyer as well as a militia officer. He'd been Attorney General in Tennessee, later a Superior Court judge, and while he had been an officer in the militia, militia officers were typically elected. That was a political role as well. He'd also been a congressman and senator from Tennessee, briefly governor of the Florida Territory. And among the common people, among the average voters, he was the most popular candidate. So that in the election of 1824, Jackson received the largest share of both the electoral and the popular votes. 99 electoral votes, over 153,000, 41% of the popular vote. Adams was a close second. 84 electoral votes, 108,000 popular votes, 31% of that. Crawford came in third and Clay fourth in the Electoral College, although third in the popular vote. But if you add all these percentages up, it reveals there was no majority in the Electoral College. And it's not enough to simply have more votes than anyone else. You must have a majority, more votes than everyone else put together. It would have taken at least 131 electoral votes to be made president. And so, for the second, and thus far last time in our history, the election had to be decided by the House of Representatives. And many people felt that because Jackson had the most electoral and popular votes, it would simply be the right thing for the House of Representatives to select him. But it was not that simple. Many leaders distrusted his wild democratic style and the Westerners who supported him. So while many of the common people liked Jackson, many political leaders distrusted him. Furthermore, the apparent second choice, John Quincy Adams, found an important ally in the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay. And the two apparently made a deal. To my knowledge, no written records of such a corrupt bargain have ever been located, but Clay, as Speaker of the House, and with many friends in the House of Representatives, used his influence to get Adams selected as president. And then, when Adams named his cabinet, he chose Clay as his Secretary of State, seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Adams himself had all been secretaries of state. And so there may well have been a corrupt bargain. That was unquestionably the accusation made by Jackson and his followers against Adams and Clay. They called Clay the Judas of the West. As these two men, apparently so opposite, would work together, as they had worked together before, creating the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812. Now, in addition to their personal disagreements, Andrew Jackson's followers, who were angry at what they saw as a stolen election, began campaigning for the 1828 election as soon as the House made its decision. They would spend the next 4 years making every possible effort to undermine and discredit Adams and his administration, foreshadowing our more recent practice of continual campaigning. Now, John Quincy Adams was short, he was bald, he was austere, he was sarcastic. He liked to have a regular schedule. He woke up at the same time every day, read his Bible, then went skinny dipping in the Potomac River. According to legend, at least, at one time a female reporter, a very rare kind of person in those days, whom he refused to let interview him in the White House, came upon him while he was bathing naked in the river and sat on the pile of clothes and refused to leave and let him get dressed till he gave her an interview. Another case, some boys going by just saw his clothes and stole them. He had to wait till somebody else was walking by to take a message to the White House to bring him another suit. Adams had been an excellent diplomat in beginning his career at the age of 10 when he was sent to Europe with a diplomatic delegation led by his father during the Revolutionary War. But like his father, his devotion to his principles, his unwillingness to compromise, his insistence on doing the right thing, even if, perhaps especially if, it was inconvenient, made him, like his father, an ineffective president in many ways. He did not make many friends while president, in large part because he did not remove from office any existing officials who were doing their jobs, and so he could not reward his supporters with many new jobs. So, with the election of 1824, the era of good feelings had definitely come to a close, and the old Jeffersonian Republican Party began to fragment into nationalist and various regional factions. The most obvious alignment, to begin with, were between those who were either for or against Henry Clay's American system, which John Quincy Adams, supported. Because Adams, like Clay, was a nationalist. In his first annual message to Congress, Adams called for an extensive and expensive system of internal improvements funded by the federal government. Roads, canals, a national university to create a shared culture among America's leaders, like Oxford or Cambridge in Britain. He wanted a national astronomical observatory. He wanted to improve harbors, build lighthouses, and construct other public works. Opponents of these plans worried they would give the federal government too much power, intruding upon states' rights, and create higher taxes, which would certainly mean a higher tariff. Indeed, the tariff was the main way Adams and Clay planned to fund all these internal improvements. Furthermore, although Adams supported exploring the West, he was cautious about actually settling it, and did not make land as cheap or readily available as many Westerners wanted, and especially land speculators, which included Andrew Jackson, who hoped to buy up Western land cheap and resell it to later settlers at a profit. Adams also tried to deal fairly with the Indians. While many Westerners, especially in the South, wanted the Indians removed from their lands forcibly, or at least restricted to smaller regions. Because at this point, many Indians still claimed large sections of land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, particularly, although not only, in the southern states. Adams tried to protect the Indians, but was opposed by states with forceful governors, most notably Georgia. And although Adams was not a Federalist per se, after all, that party largely collapsed after the Hartford Convention, Adams was a New England man and a nationalist. In many ways, a Federalist reborn. And so he did support a tariff, in part to pay for his proposed internal improvements, and also to protect our infant industries. The Tariff of 1824 raised the general tariff on imports from 23% to 37%, although many New Englanders, particularly those who owned woolen mills, wanted it raised even higher. And so here, the Jacksonians in Congress took a risky move. They proposed an even higher tariff in Congress, up to 45% in some cases, hoping to put New England and Adams in a tight spot. This tariff was so high that honestly nobody really wanted it. Certainly the Jacksonians did not actually want it. They wanted to lower the tariff as much as possible. Even most New Englanders and supporters of a protective tariff feared this was too high. So the Jacksonians hoped that either Congress would have to vote against it, even New Englanders would vote against it, or Congress would pass it, but Adams would have to veto it because it was so unpopular, and that would undermine their claims to support a high tariff if they voted against this exceptionally high one. Alternately, they just might actually pass it, and then surely it would be so unpopular it would turn people against Adams and New England. And in the end, although none of them wanted the tariff, New Englanders in Congress felt they had to support it, and Adams refused to veto it. So the Tariff of 1828 became the law of the land, despite the fact nobody really wanted it. A political gamble that did not pay off the way anybody wanted it to, at least in the short run, although arguably it did hurt Adams in the long run. And some people's views were changing. Daniel Webster, for example, had started off as a fairly traditional Jeffersonian Republican and had opposed protective tariffs. But now that he represented New England and many of his constituents worked in protected industries, he now supported a protective tariff. John C. Calhoun in South Carolina had been a strong nationalist in the 18-teens and early 1820s and had supported a protective tariff for the good of the country. But as he started to see the South, and in particular his home state of South Carolina, falling farther and farther behind in many ways, he now came to oppose protective tariffs for the sake of the Southern economy. And he in particular, but many Southerners, not all, but many, vigorously opposed what they called the Tariff of Abominations, which would turn out to be one of the highest tariffs in our nation's history. In South Carolina, flags were flown at half-mast. In the coastal South, which had once been the richest part of the country but was now perhaps the least prosperous, was hurt by the tariff economically, but also a growing number of Southerners, at least Southern leaders, was coming to feel that every time the federal government became more powerful, it also became potentially more intrusive. And a more powerful national government might act to limit or end slavery, as the British government was seriously considering doing, and in fact would do, completely banning slavery just a few years later, in the early 1830s. And Americans in general, particularly Southerners, most particularly South Carolinians, were increasingly worried about slavery. Anti-slavery movements in the North were growing in numbers and influence, although they still were fairly small and seen as fairly radical. They were less small and less beyond the pale than had once been the case. In South Carolina, there had recently been an attempt at a slave revolt. Now, all the way back in 1800, a slave named Denmark Vesey won $600 in the lottery, and with that money purchased his own freedom. He became a preacher and told slaves to resist their masters, saying slavery was against the Bible and against the Declaration of Independence. And in 1822, he planned a revolt, Vesey's Rebellion, which was meant to seize Charleston, capture the local arsenal, kill all the white people in town, free the slaves, burn down the city, and spark a larger slave uprising in South Carolina. However, one of his co-conspirators may have been okay with killing most white people, but did happen to like his own master, apparently, and tried to warn a couple people, maybe get out of town for a little bit, except that ended up giving the whole thing away. Vesey and 34 other black men were hanged for plotting this rebellion. Although some people have questioned whether he really plotted this or not, or if this was simply an accusation made to control the local population. I believe the rebellion really was intended. So this had many Southerners, especially in South Carolina, worried about how the federal government might one day try to affect slavery. And so, in worried that the Tariff of Abominations might lead to greater government power and intrusion in general, both in terms of economics and larger implications, Vice President John C. Calhoun anonymously published the South Carolina Exposition. This was similar to the Kentucky Resolution, the Virginia Resolutions of a previous generation, reviving the idea of nullification. The idea that any state could declare a law to be unconstitutional, and that law would then be null and void within that state's boundaries. And if a state felt that a federal law was unconstitutional, they would simply ignore it within their state lines. And furthermore, this South Carolina Exposition argued specifically that the Tariff of 1828 was unjust, unconstitutional, and worthy of nullification. Now, Calhoun did not want to tear apart the United States. He hoped that nullification would be a way for very different states to remain united around their common interests and get around the issues that separated them. Essentially a way to politically agree to disagree, which may well have been a noble goal. But of course it would not work. And while South Carolina did threaten to nullify the tariff, they did not for now. And no other southern state attempted to nullify it either, even though the South in general was opposed to the tariff. Furthermore, after the election of 1828, the nullifiers would have a more resolute president than John Quincy Adams with whom to contend.